Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Dr. Nguyen, I'll pass it over to you if you'd like to get started with facilitating this next session.
Hi there. I think I can sort of see some folks. I'm not 100% sure. Sorry, I got this wide camera view here, but I know this session was intended to be set up to talk sort of more about AANAPISis and UC San Diego's recent status as an eligible AANAPISi as of January of this year. And so I really want to just have a discussion, a more in-depth discussion, sort of get into sort of more of the nitty-gritty compared to what the presentation I had earlier, which was sort of more general about AANAPISis, but for us to be able to sort of chat and conversation about what does it mean to sort of be an AANAPISi and sort of the work that the potential, really the promise and the potential of this status and what it means for UC San Diego. So so happy to talk more about that and also answer questions from you all sitting there. So I wanted this to sort of be informal in that sense. So that's sort of how we were envisioning it. So want to sort of open it up for folks to be able to share. Maybe we can just actually start by doing introductions. So I sort of know who's in the room and maybe what you're interested in knowing more about with respect to AANAPISis.
Yeah, could we have folks introduce themselves on the mic so that Dr. Nguyen can get a feel for who's in the room. I can have the mic come to you if anyone wants to go first. I guess I'll give an introduction. Hi, Dr. Nguyen. My name is Diana Go, and I'm an Intake and Operations Coordinator for Case Management Services, and I'm also serving on the planning committee for this symposium.
Thanks, Diana. And again, I so apologize that I'm not there in person. We can just sort of sit around one table and do this. So my sincerest apologies about that.
Hi, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Great. Yeah, my name's Jim Lin. I retired math professor at UCSD, but I actually taught the very first Asian American Studies class at UCSD back in 1986, so 36 years ago. So I just had this question, whether people study sort of the issues of American-born Asians, because when I taught my class, I'd say 90% of them were American-born Asians. And because of the 1965 Nationality Act, that there was this huge flood of highly educated immigrants that came to the US, and I would guess you'd have this separation between like a community college like Mesa College or De Anza College, which was maybe less selective than the UC campuses. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the sons and daughters of immigrants would, have a very high level of education, so they'd get admitted to a UC campus. Whereas schools like De Anza and Mesa College that are less selective would tend to get the third and fourth generation Asians. So is that an issue that's studied? It would seem like it would be this is all, I'm speculating. I don't know whether my thinking is correct, but if so, that would really change the kind of experiences that students that go to community colleges would have versus the kind of experiences that students who went to a higher, a research public institution would have. So do you know any stuff that's written about that, or?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting that interesting point there that you offer there. I can't say there's a lot of research out there about sort of college trajectory, given not a whole lot, particularly regarding immigration immigration sort of generationally, right? A lot more is sort of just done about if you're like the first generation to go to college or the second generation to go to college, right? Rather than connecting that to sort of immigration history. So I guess what the broader literature tells us is if your parents attended post-secondary education, you're more likely to go. You're more likely to go to more selective institutions, et cetera, versus sort of the complexity of the immigration history and the way that impacts if you're going to a more selective or more open access institution. But I think what the literature broadly tells us is if you've got sort of, if your family does have higher SES, and that means that you might have come because of the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act, you're more likely to go to more selective institutions versus, say, if you came later on, your families came later on, like Southeast Asian families did as refugees, you'll find a lot more of those students at schools like De Anza, at schools like Mesa, and community colleges that are much more open access, right? So in fact, a lot of those community colleges that are AANAPISis and have AANAPISi programs tend to actually design them to really serve three populations on their campuses: primarily Southeast Asian students, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students, and Filipinx students tend to be the three largest communities that a lot of these community colleges, and I should preface by saying community colleges in California are serving primarily a lot of those students. Now, if we sort of look at schools in the East Coast, like for instance Hunter College in New York City, which is an AANAPISi, and that's sort of an open access four-year institution, sort of similar to like a CSU school system, our California CSU system. They actually end up having a lot of first-generation college students, as well as students who are either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants. And so those are sort of the general patterns that we're seeing. But to be completely honest with you, there is not a lot of empirical research about sort of connecting immigration patterns and immigration history, particularly for Asian Americans in college trajectory. So noted that is like a huge area of that's missing in the scholarship. And in addition to that, already there's just so little research on Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in general, in all sectors, especially in education. And so something like that is particularly lacking in the literature.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. So, anybody else have questions? I've got lots of questions.
No, I could talk about this all day. So
yeah. So, I think for me, when I taught my course, the most powerful thing I did is I brought in 10 speakers, 10 people from outside because I had no background teaching Asian American studies. So, it was crazy. I got on the phone and asked, would you come speak because you would make a difference in my course? And just by the way, Min Yasui, who was in Denver, I don't know if you heard of him. I mean, he went to the Supreme Court. You don't know him, huh? Or hadn't heard of him? Yeah.
No, can you say the name again? It sort of cut out.
Min Yasui.
Oh, sure. I just from reading things, yeah.
Yeah. So he was one of my keynote speakers, and just meeting these amazing speakers, no matter what I said in Asian American studies, I couldn't compare with the 10 speakers who came because, seeing is believing. Seeing a lawyer like Min Yasui, seeing a children's author like Lawrence Yep, seeing a politician like Norman Mineta, actually seeing them in person and talking to them and going out to dinner with them was much more powerful in terms of Asian American studies than any kind of lecture that I could give. And back then, there was just a handbook of notes that you would, everyone would read this handbook and then they'd discuss it. That was a course in Asian American Studies. But anyway, now, even today, right, there's such a huge shortage of Asian Americans who will get up and speak about what it's like to succeed in law or to become a politician or to, be a children's author. And so a lot of the students at UCSD, and I'm a math professor, they would gravitate toward STEM fields because that's the message they taught. It's like, your formula for success is to go to UCSD and major in some STEM field, and then you're going to have success in life. So I just wonder, at least that's what I think is the need, is that we need more role models that our students can meet that, instill pride in the accomplishments of Asian Americans.
Thanks for bringing that point up. I will say, one, I'm a product of Asian American Studies. That was what I studied as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, and so that was really formative in in those types of speakers who came and to my classes were formative in my understanding of sort of what really helped drive my capacity and my ambitions to do this work today. I will say, the schools that have received AANAPISI funding are doing exactly what you are saying. Sacramento State, for instance, has been a funded AANAPISI for close to a decade now, given their sort of proximity to Sacramento. They are located in the state capital. They are often bringing in assembly members and state senators. They have students go visit and do tours with elected officials, with community organizers, with community-based organizations. I mentioned Hunter College earlier in New York. They actually have distinct partnerships with Asian American serving organizations all across New York in order for students to do internships and get exposed to that work. And many of them end up graduating and working for some of those organizations. De Anza College, again, in the Bay Area, has done a whole lot of this, where they have a whole civic engagement initiative within their AANAPISI that connects students with local elected officials, including Norman Mineta. Obviously, the late and great Norman Mineta, as well as other AANAPISIs across the country doing similar work in that sense. I think what is sort of really special about a lot of these schools and what they use their money for is they're sort of going back into the roots and the historical roots of the field of Asian American Studies, right? Really finding ways to connect curriculum back to communities, sort of the origin story of ethnic studies. And so it's sort of this federal infusion of funding to be able to connect sort of the ivory tower, if you will, to community-based efforts, or in some cases policy-based efforts, all focusing on Asian American Pacific Islander experiences. So some really powerful stuff, I think, happening at a lot of these schools. And then on the other hand, you have schools like Mount SAC, right, sort of in East Los Angeles, that has really heavily Pacific Islander student population. And what they're doing instead is sort of building leadership initiatives and sort of redefining what leadership means for students. And getting them more actually engaged on campus initiatives, being leaders themselves, and sort of inspiring one another in that sense. So, there's sort of it's sort of, again, the as you mentioned, the original ethnic studies, Asian American Studies playbook, and doing that type of work, I think it's no one is trying to recreate the wheel here, right? We know it's worked in the past, and so now they're using funding to sort of redo these in a new way and new innovative ways and using new technologies to bring in people. You know, we have Zoom now, we can bring folks in from across the country. And so, so I think they're doing that. I think they're doing that. And I think it is remains as powerful as it was, I imagine, when you did the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah. Okay, well, thanks for your talk. Appreciate it, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hi, can you see me and hear me?
Yeah.
Hi.
I can see. I don't know if you all know where the camera is. It's to your left there.
Oh, it is.
Is it good?
Oh, okay, hi.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm probably showing you the back of my head. That was lovely. My name is Wendy Yamamoto, and I am a career advisor, actually, for graduate students in computer science and engineering. I have to admit that I stuck around for your talk, partly because I was feeling it's a big, heavy lunch and I felt disinclined to move, but mostly because I was secretly hoping there would be a ton of people asking you questions, because I had no idea what an AANAPISI was before you started talking about it. But the beautiful part is that I suddenly got an idea of what a question is, and you obviously have a lot of expertise and thoughts on this. So this is a very random hypothetical question. Since UCSD's AANAPISI money is brand new, and if you were in charge of this money, what would you do with it at UCSD? Your fantasy come true.
Oh, this is such a fun question. Thank you for asking me like the most fun thing that we get to do. So first thing, UC San Diego just became an eligible AANAPISI as of January, right? A lot of the work actually done by Wendy, who did there's a lot of grunt work that needs to happen in that process to get all the numbers from a bunch of different people to file for that waiver, right? And so she played a huge role in getting that waiver, to move that waiver through, really during winter break, quite frankly. And so I don't know why the Department of Ed sets out these applications during the worst times of the year, but certainly they did over winter break. And so that means that now, given that waiver for Section 312B, and then having the at least 10% undergraduate AAPI student population, UC San Diego is now an eligible AANAPISI. There's actually only been one other UC school that actually has received AANAPISI funding, or what we call a funded AANAPISI, since the creation of this designation, and that's UC Irvine, right? But the rest, except for pretty much Berkeley and UCLA, are all eligible AANAPISIs through the waiver process, like what UC San Diego just did in January of this year. So that means that now, if every year, Wendy and whoever else you work with is going to have to keep submitting this waiver usually every December, January, right, to maintain this eligibility status. Because in about 4 years, there's going to be a new grant application for AANAPISI funding, and this will usually come sometime in the late spring. Usually is when it gets announced, and it's a 60-day window to apply for this grant. And what that means is, if you're awarded the grant, you usually get around $300,000 to $400,000 a year over a 5-year period. So in some cases, if you're a community college, that's a whole lot of money, right? If you're a UC school, it may not, broadly speaking, it's not the biggest pot of money that's going to come to the school, but for our AAPI communities, I would argue that's a pretty significant amount of federal investment. It would be great if there was even more, but it's not laughable, right? You can do some real good with that level of funding, right? So with that in mind, what would UC San Diego do with that money? Really, I think the best approach is what a lot of the AANAPISI community is calling a three-legged stool, right? And so it's three main legs. One is an academic-based leg. So this is usually tied to curriculum and courses. And so this means a lot of times it's housed in Asian American studies. It means offering new classes in Asian American studies, redesigning courses, partnering with other disciplines like in STEM and building that stuff out. So there's a academic curricular component. The second is a student services component. This is typically connecting actually in more of a four-year university case, actually working with career centers. It'd be partnerships with career services. It would be partnerships with student affairs, different student affairs units. Usually, and in some cases, if schools have it, like a cultural center, right? And so it's usually a cultural center with career services and student affairs, all sort of working in concert together to offer a host of co-curricular student activities. So this is, in addition to that, we're talking about internships, other types of community engagement, campus-based engagement. So the whole co-curricular aspect would be sort of the second leg. And then the third leg is, given that UC San Diego is a research university, there's got to be, it only makes sense to have a research component as the third leg, right? So sometimes we see this at schools that have research centers focused on Asian Americans or sort of ethnic studies or sort of some type of focus on race, some institute that does that type of work. And so then it's that would be the area that then resources could be used for producing applied research that connects that connects sort of the AAPI experience to broader issues happening locally or nationally or statewide. But it's using it for knowledge production, right? But what that means is that faculty there get to access some of those funds for their research projects. But it's not just for faculty. There's an expectation that a lot of that resource is going to go to support graduates, in some cases graduate students or undergraduate students, to give them research experience. So when you think about it, right, an undergraduate student can then sort of access all three legs of that stool, right? Or if they only just want one of those things or two of those things, they can go to either one of those, right? And so that is, I think that's sort of the sort of promising practices, if you will, that make a lot of sense. Lastly, I'll say this is going to sound, I'm sure you all agree with this, but I think we all know, we all work in higher education in some capacity or another, that space on any college campus is a premium, right? Physical space. And so we've seen that AANAPISis that get the funding and have dedicated space is critically important for students to sort of congregate and hang out. That is really, really special. So a school like UMass Boston has actually done something that's really unique. They've got spaces in sort of all of those sectors for students to hang out across. There were schools like De Anza where they just had one space across sort of all of those activities. But at the end of the day, there's some sort of physical space for students to be able to spend time at, right? And I think that's really, really, really important. Now, this might be a little bit more different at a school like UC San Diego, where students tend to less be commuter students than say a school than a community college or others. But at the end of the day, we want that student interaction. There's a lot of real benefits to that, and so when you think about all three of those legs of that stool, you also want to think about how do you have a physical space that can bring everybody together and sort of build that type of collaboration, energy, and sort of interaction. But I think end of the day, that three-legged stool model is a really good one, particularly for a research-based institution like UC San Diego.
Does anyone else have any other questions right now? I have one question. So this may be because of my lack of knowledge of AANAPISis, but as you know, this symposium also covers the Middle Eastern descent experience of our students. So I was just wondering how maybe that might be integrated into institutions that are AANAPISi serving, or if you've seen any programming that's specifically dedicated to that group of students, or if there's maybe a different kind of federal funding that has been allocated to that particular population.
Really great question. Thanks for asking that and for highlighting it. And that's an area certainly that I didn't even cover in my presentation for a number of reasons. I will say that, the federal government, right, so a lot of these designations are based off state-based race classifications by the federal government, right? So given that Middle Eastern, North African populations are considered white, right, in federal classification, there is no sort of MSI designation to support these students. Unbelievably ironic, right? But I guess many of us are not necessarily surprised by that. So I think that's a huge area of improvement for the federal government. And then based on that, then the Department of Education can then think about what that means within their suite of federal MSIs, right? And so right now, there isn't any sort of special targeted funding for it. Now, with that in mind, are there some AANAPISis around the country that are serving this population? Yeah, indeed they are, right? One, again, is actually Hunter College in New York City, which has specific programming for, and has just given the population in the diversity in New York City and diversity of their student demographics, they're serving these students. Ironically, though, these students don't count in that 10%, in that 10% count, right? And so what are the implications for that? Well, it means that schools that are maybe on the cusp, like 9%, that might have a large population to serve, they can't count those and thus access the funding. So there's a lot. This is the limitation of this federal policy, is that there's no. Right now, the federal government does not classify and count these students in a way that probably makes the most sense, and so it makes it difficult. Now, I think any AANAPISI, any MSI really is never going to turn away a student of color coming in that is looking to access resources, right? And so that's why we see schools like Hunter design initiatives and programs that serve these students. So I was just actually in Hunter 2 weeks ago. They're actually working with them and collecting data, and they had this huge ceremony and event. And they had students come up saying, my parents are from Yemen, and my parents are from, and yet they are served by their AANAPISI. They partner with API Scholars, which is a national-based scholarship organization that provides funding and scholarships for students at AANAPISis. They give money and resources to those students also. And so I think what we're seeing is the federal government this is where there's a big gap in federal policy and needs refinement and revisions to that federal policy. But what we're seeing at the institutional level, as well as sort of the community-based organization level, is that we're still serving these students because of the way our campuses are the diversity of our campuses, right? So I think that's what makes AANAPISis unique, is that that's not what they were written into law to do, but that's not what's happening on the ground. And so these schools and these programs, as well as community organizations, are still serving students that maybe the legislation did not specifically name or intentionally target. So there's a lot of room to revise that federal policy in a lot of ways, right? I'm not sure which is the best way to go, quite frankly. I think a lot of that is being, I think a lot of the communities have been advocating at the Census Bureau actually to collect that more accurately. And then from there, I think you will see the federal agencies and departments respond, or legislation to get those federal agencies and departments to respond. But I think a lot of that's going to have to start with the way the census collects the data before any of that sort of trickles down, unfortunately. So it's going to be some time, I think, until we get there. But meanwhile, without a doubt, AANAPISis that have that student population are working to support those students.
Hi, doctor. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah. And it's just Mike, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Mike, hi. My name is Jessica Wilson. I'm the Master's Career Advisor within our Career Services Center. This may be a dumb question, but I'm curious about how does the designation of being an AANAPISI influence admissions, application rates of diverse students on campus, as well as any staffing changes. Have there been any studies done, and what does the research say about, just sheer numbers?
Yeah, great question. So this is a bit of a tricky one actually, because if we use UC San Diego as an example, right? Just this January became an eligible AANAPISI per meeting all the requirements, or in this case, getting the waiver approved, right? And so now adding to the list of 190-ish schools across the country that are eligible AANAPISIs. There are not a whole lot of studies, particularly within the AANAPISI sector, that look at sort of how all that impacts enrollment, overall enrollment, or like faculty and staff demographic shifts for a lot of different reasons. One is, I think, sort of at the most practical level, right? Becoming an AANAPISI or becoming an HSI, if you will, right? These are predominantly white institutions or historically white institutions that have over time, because of demographic shifts, now meet some federal construct, some federal enrollment construct that Congress decided it needs to meet in order to meet this status, right? And so just because you meet it doesn't really necessarily mean much. It can happen, right? Like, I don't know if your chancellor sent out a message after you in January or February saying, hey, everyone, we're now an eligible AANAPISI. My guess is probably not, right? And this is not really uncommon. If you look at the early days of HSIs, same thing, right? They were struggling to sort of get recognition on campus. And now we're sort of at an interesting moment in sort of higher education history, where schools are now beginning to sort of brand themselves as HSIs and are a little bit proud of it, right? But if you sort of rewind 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there was a moment in time where that status was a bit, people were afraid to talk about that as being an HSI. Similarly, I think the same thing with AANAPISIs, but sort of couple that in with all the sort of racialized stereotypes about Asian American Pacific Islander students adds another layer of complexity, I think, for AANAPISIs. So sort of thinking about all those factors is one thing. And then the other is, just because you have this eligibility status doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting money from the federal government, right? And if you do get money, it's about $300,000 to $400,000 a year in a big UCSD budget of probably in the billions, right? And so it can be a drop in the bucket to begin to see any big movable shifts. What we see instead, right, is that when you develop these AANAPISI programs on your campus, if you do receive the funding, you see these little shifts and increments within the program. So you see certain staff get hired in certain areas. You see potentially faculty get hired in certain areas, or you see certain new classes get developed that normally would the institution would be unable to do. You would see new types of student programming and student services, co-curricular activities being designed and institutionalized that normally would not get, people wouldn't have the time, energy, or resources to do. So I think those are some of the shifts you see happening more at the programmatic level than you do at the larger institutional level. But that's also because, AANAPISIs are the newest kid on the block, right? They're 15 years old. And so we have a lot of time to go before we can get to that sort of, to the stage where HSIs are at. And don't get me wrong, HSIs are, if you talk to any of them, they're still struggling in that sense on their campuses too, right? And so this is why I always say it's when we talk about this federal suite of 11 different MSIs, is that there are big differences between AANAPISIs and HSIs, which we call enrollment-based MSIs, versus your tribal colleges and your HBCUs, which we call your mission-based MSIs, right? Those institutions from the ground up were built to serve those populations, and they don't have enrollment-based requirements, right? There are right now 96 HBCUs. There will never be more than 96 at this point, right? Per the way they were created and established Unfortunately, their numbers can only drop if schools close. Tribal colleges, on the other hand, there's about 35 of them, and there can be more and more. You can actually develop more, but they have to be established through a federally recognized tribe. And so a federally recognized tribe has to actually build one from that tribe, and so you can actually see more increase, but it doesn't happen as quickly or as regularly as you do HSIs and AANAPISis that come in and out of different statuses from year to year to year because of enrollment patterns and shifts. And so you have to sort of thinking about those histories and how these schools are. Some schools, like mission-based MSIs, are from the ground up built to serve that population, while your enrollment-based MSIs are through meeting various federal requirements established by Congress. You get this status, and so now the next stage is how do you begin to build awareness of this on your campus, right? That's where a lot of the heavy lifting has to happen. And it's actually really hard to do because once you get the money, as say in AANAPISI, you're really focused on serving your students rather than thinking about how do we sort of build this broader identity on a college campus, right? And we see that happen in some schools when there's a lot of senior level administrators who have really bought into it, who believe in it, and who are supportive, and sort of and they're focused on that sort of institutionalized identity piece, while other folks are doing the sort of day-to-day of serving the students through co-curricular activities or academic curriculum, right? Or research projects. And so that's sort of where we are in the AANAPISI stage. But I'm really optimistic, right? If you look at sort of the way AANAPISis have evolved over the past 15 years, and you sort of put that in line with the way HSIs have evolved, a lot of us in the AANAPISi world give so much credit to the HSI community because we have learned so much from the way they've done things, and are sort of, we're like in line and in the same pattern that they've been doing since they were established in 1995. And so we're right on track, if not actually going a little bit faster, because they've written the playbook and we're just following that playbook. So I'm really optimistic that we'll sort of get to where HSIs are at today, and then as HSIs keep advancing, we'll keep advancing along with them. So that's sort of, it doesn't really, I know it really doesn't answer your question because it's a really good question and a really interesting and complex question. So, but that's sort of, hopefully that gives you a bit of a snapshot of sort of where we are and what the sort of obstacles and barriers are to sort of get to that stage that that you're talking about.
I think we have time for a couple more questions if anyone has any.
And I apologize that I'm not there in person. To make this more of a roundtable and less of a Q&A on Zoom. I'm so sorry.
No problem. Do you have any questions that you wanted to pose to the group, or maybe any final thoughts that we should keep in mind as we continue to serve this population on our campus and potentially even become an AANAPISi now that we're eligible as a campus?
Yeah, thanks for saying for that, Diana. I will say one thing to think about, right, is the next grant cycle is going to come in about 4 years, and this is a wonderful opportunity for EC San Diego to apply and submit an application to get federal funding to do this. I think what it means is to begin to sort of build a task force, if you will, to start thinking about and planning out what it might look like on your campus, right? That means bringing in all the relevant stakeholders and think about how you would, the types of programming and services you do, and get all that squared away, because by the time the grant comes out, you'll have 60 days, usually a 60 days window to do a big federal grant. And that's usually not enough time. And somehow they always figure out the worst time of year to release the grant application. So I would say start now while you've got a lot of time, and build that task force and those relationships. That way everything comes a lot smoother when it's time to actually submit the application. The other thing I would say is they're sort of beginning informally to build a UC AANAPISI initiative, right? Sort of being run out of UCOP with representatives from all the different campuses. So if you're not in these meetings, you should be. I don't know who would be the point person on campus to be the AANAPISI person representing UCSD. Maybe a few of you from different units, someone from the faculty side, someone from the student affairs side, from student services side, right? Someone from the senior administrative ranks might make a lot of sense to get in on these. I think they're quarterly meetings, if I'm not mistaken, and to be in community with other UC schools that are sort of working through a lot of the same issues, right, and trying to figure out what all of this means. And so I think that only will strengthen your AANAPISI should you get funding for it. But then also think about how do you sort of partner with the CSU schools in the area as well as the community colleges in the area. This is really, I think, really important to do because students will be transferring, and the AANAPISI is a natural. You can build a natural pathway to transfer from Mesa to San Diego that way, right? And those are the students that the AANAPISI, the funding was intended to serve, right? Generally low income, first generation college students, and so Asian American Pacific Islander college students, and so those are sort of the three big areas I would start thinking about now. Is building sort of a task force, getting and participating in that UC-wide initiative, and then thinking about reaching out to some of the other institutions in the area that you might want to work with collaboratively. By the way, the Department of Ed has begun to actually create new AANAPISI grants for collaborative-based approaches, and so schools can actually access different pots of money if they collaborate with another institution, usually in the regional area. And so theoretically, you can actually get 2 AANAPISI grants. One for your campus as a whole, and then a collaborative grant where you work with another institution. So there's a lot of sort of interesting things happening in that space, and I think it's designed in a way because it's thinking about what are some mechanisms that we can really support and serve those low-income first-gen AAPI students. And so, yeah, that's what I would be thinking about. And I think we know in the world of higher ed, 4 years goes really fast, and so. Before we know it, it's been 4 years on a college campus. And so, yeah, I think the sooner the better to start planning and organizing. That way, when the grant gets released, you can strike while the iron is really hot.
Awesome. Thank you so much again. Does anyone have any final thoughts in the group? If not, thank you again, Mike. Thank you so much for your time and your ability to join us virtually today. We'll give you back a few minutes to your day, maybe to rest, and glad to see you're doing all right. And for everyone else, we do have a break now, and if you could come back into the main ballroom at 2:10, we'll have our last final big session, and then closing right afterwards. Thank you again, Mike.
Thank you. Sorry again I couldn't be there in person. I really wish I could be there with you all and spend the whole day with everyone. So I apologize again, and thank you for being so flexible and finding a way to let me Zoom in as opposed to missing this entire thing. So thank you.